Good evening, comrades. Nice to see so many people here again, and I hope everybody's not been feeling too bad about watching the sunshine outside. And we can have a break from listening to stuff about Phil the Greek this evening as well, which would be as good. I mean, I've had it on virtually every radio station all day. So tonight, continuation of Tony's fabulous series on Zionism, this time looking at left Zionism. Those who've seen Tony's blog submission this morning, very long blog submission, which I thought was very good, explaining some of the items in this talk. Interesting thing is, of course, with the current state of Zionism and its position on the right, of course, is that for much of its time, actually as a movement, or certainly for a section of its time, it was perceived to be at least in some degree egalitarian or on the left, and certainly to a degree up until probably certainly from 1945 until sometime probably the late 70s, possibly even into the 80s, although that probably stopped somewhere around about the war in against Lebanon in the early 80s. So it was supported by large sections of the left. So the question that Tony's put before us this evening is, essentially, was there a left element to Zionism, and if so, what was it, and what his critique of it? So, do you want to? Tony will speak for about probably 40 minutes or so.
Please, Tony, don't with the cigarette, please.
All right. Okay, comrades, I'm just getting myself acquainted with this. Okay, right, I'll start now. Well, welcome to everybody. I was in two minds really up to now whether this should go ahead, because the BBC told us today that we have a nation in mourning, and knowing how sensitive members of this group are, I did wonder whether we should postpone it for a week, but nonetheless, I was persuaded to go ahead. So the question really is socialist Zionism, socialism and Zionism, in fact. And as Matthew said, when we grew up, certainly when I grew up, I was told that I believed that Israel was really the only socialist country in the world, and the kibbutz in particular, the collective settlements, were a prime example of socialism in action. And I go further. It was the Labour right, people like Christopher Mayhew, Andrew Watkins and others on the right who supported the Arabs and the Palestinians. It was the Labour left, the Tribune group, people like Anoran Bevan, Ian Mercado, Joe Richardson, who were the strongest supporters of Zionism. And that really only changed with the advent of the Lebanon War, the invasion of Lebanon by Israel in 1982, when people like Tony Benn and Eric Heffer resigned from Labour Friends of Israel, and we gradually saw the change to an anti-imperialist analysis and understanding of the situation in Palestine. But we have to, I think, go back somewhat. The question is Zionism. I mean, I grew up, as I say, and I became a Marxist, I don't know, at the age of about 14, 15, really. I had become a socialist. And to me, the problem with Zionism was it was always an exclusivist project. Socialism is a universal movement. It believes in universalist ideas. The workers of the world unite. It's an internationalist project. With Zionism, it's focused very much on Jews as an exclusive group. It prioritizes unity of the Jewish people, whatever their class, vis-a-vis everyone else. And that was to me the prime reason for having my doubts about Zionism. But the myth has always grown up, and it's still very common, that Zionism had its roots in socialism, in socialist activists. And of course, this is an absolute myth. I say I posted my blog, but I think it's worth going through some of the things in it. As you know, Theodor Herzl was the founder of political Zionism. And he wrote a pamphlet, The Jewish State, which I quoted from at length last week, in 1896. And in 1897, there was the first World Zionist Congress, the first Zionist Congress, which was held at Basel in Switzerland. And I think I said that the reason it was held there was because when they attempted to hold it in Munich, where there was a large Jewish community, the Jews of that community rose up in protest and accused the authorities of anti-Semitism for allowing this group. Don't forget, Zionism was unique in its reaction to anti-Semitism, in that it accepted the terms of reference of the anti-Semites, in that it accepted that Jews did not belong. And this is exactly what the anti-Semites said. So to most Jews, Zionism was a form of anti-Semitism in itself. And so most Jews reacted in an extremely hostile manner to an organization which was really echoing everything that their opponents had said. But regardless, I mean, Theodor Herzl, was quite clear on the Zionist project and how he was going to go about winning the struggle for a Jewish state. And it was through an alliance with one or more of the major imperial powers. And Herzl traveled around Europe. He met the Ottoman Sultan, he met the Pope, Victor Emmanuel, the German Kaiser. He met the Grand Duke of Baden, who was the uncle of the Kaiser. It was quite interesting. The Grand Duke told Herzl that he was all in favor of the Zionist project, but his only fear was that if he came out and said this publicly, people would accuse him of being an anti-Semite. So that is the flavor of the debate as it occurred. But Herzl was quite clear in what he said. He wrote to the Kaiser, describing how our movement has everywhere to fight an embittered battle with the revolutionary parties, which rightly sense an adversary in it. We're in need of encouragement, even though it has to be carefully kept secret. And likewise, in a letter to Baroness Suttner, one of Zionism's main supporters in Britain, Herzl described how we are everywhere engaged in battles with the revolutionaries and are actually turning the young students as well as the Jewish working men away from socialism and nihilism by unfolding before them a pure and national ideal. And this wasn't just Herzl's own fantasies, although he certainly overestimated the strength of the Zionist movement. No less than Winston Churchill printed in about 1920 an article in the Times, Zionism or Bolshevism. In other words, the Jews could either support Zionism, which was, as he saw it, a movement in alliance by then with British imperialism, or it could go with the Bolsheviks and the revolutionaries. And this was the two kinds of Jewish people that he encountered. So it was quite clear to most people at that time that Zionism was hand in hand with the enemies of the Jews. And indeed, in an interview with Lucian Wolff, Lucian Wolff was interviewing Count von Plehve, who was the Tsarist interior minister, when he came over to London. He had been directly responsible for the Kishinev pogrom in Russia in 1903, April 1903. Von Plehve came out and said quite clearly that in his eyes, Zionism was an antidote to socialist doctrines. And there you have it. Zionism was the alternative, if you like, solution for Jewish people as opposed to socialism. So how is it that people have come away with the idea that there was any connection between socialism and Zionism? And the answer to that is that in Russia, in the Pale of Settlement, where anti-Semitism was clearly a major problem, no Zionist group could gain any credence or could gain any base in the working class if they simply ignored the question of anti-Semitism and the living conditions of the Jewish people living in the shtetls, the small towns dotted around the Pale of Settlement. So socialist Zionism was really a consequence of the need to try and reconcile two things. On the one hand, to fight for your conditions where you are, to fight against anti-Semitism and the pogromists. And on the other hand, the belief that somehow a solution could be found through the colonization of Palestine. And so socialist Zionism was always a kind of schizophrenic movement. It was looking two ways, both to Palestine on the one hand and to the immediate conditions that workers would face where they were actually living. And it was out of that was born socialist Zionism. Now, I don't want to go into the history of it. I mean, small groups were created around the beginning of the 20th century. And in 1906 in Poltava, Ukraine, the first conference of Poal Zion, the workers of Zion, came about. But socialist Zionism was never particularly strong in Russia. I mean, there were waves. I mean, certainly the idea, I mean, Herzl initially when he became famous, was seen as some kind of a messiah who would take the Jews out of where they were to a promised land where they would be free. But that in essence was, again, a fantasy. I mean, it never actually accorded with reality. Indeed, between the middle of the 19th century and the First World War, over 2 million Jews emigrated from Tsarist Russia, and barely 1% of them went to Palestine. So Palestine was never a realistic option. However, there was a major Jewish group which did establish roots, and that was the Bund, the General Jewish Workers' Union of Lithuania, Poland, and Russia. And by the beginning of the 20th century, it had about 40,000 adherents, although it fell away as time went by. And the Bund was an anti-Zionist group. It held that the Jews in Eastern Europe had certain national characteristics. They spoke the same language, Yiddish. They lived in very much the same territory. They were part of the same economy and so on. And so the Bund demanded national cultural autonomy. And indeed, the Bund parted company from the Russian Social Democratic Party because it claimed an autonomous right to represent all Jewish workers. And there was a fierce debate with Lenin and others, Martov included, over this question. But the Bund, without a doubt, was the major socialist group within the Jewish community. And when Poland was established in 1918, where the Zionists initially were strong and they were represented in the Polish parliament, the Bund grew in strength as anti-Semitism developed, and the Zionists, of course, had no answer to anti-Semitism. And by 1938, the last free elections in Poland, the local authority elections, in Warsaw, for example, the Bund gained 17 of the 20 Jewish council seats up for election. The Zionists gained precisely 1. And that was repeated throughout Poland. The second major Jewish community was in Lodz, and again the Bund won an overall majority. They also entered into an electoral alliance with the Polish Socialist Party, so they commanded a majority, but the ruling Colonel's government simply annulled those elections and were never put into place. Indeed, in Poland, Poal Zion underwent major traumas of its own. In 1919, at a conference of Poal Zion. It split into left Poal Zion and right Poal Zion. And the left Poal Zion was by far and away the biggest group. The right Poal Zion virtually disappeared. And the reason was because Palestine, again, had no grip on reality. It was not a solution to any major section of Polish Jewry. And the left Poal Zion, as time went on, became less and less Zionist and more socialist, because that I say, accorded with reality. Now, the question is, what happened? Labour Zionism, how did Labour Zionism develop outside Europe, in Palestine? Well, the first aliyah, it's called, the wave of emigration, was the capitalist or the planter emigration between 1882 and 1904, where people went over mainly from the Lovers of Zion group, Pinska's group, and colonized Palestine in certain of the colonies supported by Baron Edmund Rothschilds in particular. But they were traditional planters, if you like, traditional style colonists who were quite content for the Arabs to do the work and they would get the benefits. The difference with Labour Zionism, this is absolutely crucial, is the Labour Zionists weren't going over there in order to benefit or live off the sweated labour of the Arabs. They were going there to actually do the work of colonization. In their view, the Arabs should play no part in the colonization. On the contrary, they should be excluded. And there were three major campaigns that the Labour Zionists, the second Aliyah from 1904 to 1914 was called the Labour Zionist Aliyah, wave of immigration. And they campaigned on three issues: Jewish labor, Jewish land, and Jewish produce. Jewish land was, quite simply, you would buy up the land. It was usually done via the Jewish National Fund, which bought it from our absentee Arab landlords. And then the Palestinians, or the Arabs who were living on it, would be evicted. They would have no further part in growing crops or in tilling the land, etc. They would simply be disregarded. And a very good description of this, ironically, is after the 1929 riots in Palestine, which occurred as a result of the growing Zionist presence. The British government commissioned an inquiry under Sir John Hope Simpson. It's the Hope Simpson report. And it's available on the internet. You can download it from the Jewish Virtual Library, for example. And it gives an extremely good analysis of the situation facing the Arabs, whereby although the Zionists made all their professions of friendship and wished to cooperate, in practice, it was anything but that. They sought to exclude them, first from the land and then from the country. And the major campaign that they had, and the second one that we've had, Jewish land, was Jewish labor. And for this, the Histadrut, which was the Zionist trade union, imposed a levy on every Jewish worker. And the purpose of Jewish labor was to exclude Arab labor from employment by Jewish employers. And Ben Gurion was quite clear. He said, regarding the Arab workers, that Zionism was not justice in the world. So Zionism was not an instrument of social revolution amongst the Arabs. Nothing is further from the mind of Jewish labor than to engineer disputes with all the material and political loss in their train. And he coined the slogan, from class to nation. And incidentally, one of the best books on this is by Zev Sternhol, the late Zev Sternhol. He was a professor at the Hebrew University, The Founding Myths of Israel, I think it's called, but I will double check on that. And what he described was how socialist Zionism or labor Zionism developed. The first major organization of the labor Zionists was the creation of a so-called trade union called Histadrut. Many of you may have heard that. And in 1920, the two labor Zionist parties, Hapoel Hatzair, which was explicitly non or anti-socialist, and Achdut HaAvodah, which came from Poel Zion, formed Histadrut. Histadrut ended up owning in Israel, it was the second largest employer after the state itself. Eventually all its enterprises collapsed and were privatized, but for a very large part of Zionist history, the Histadrut was the major employer as well as the trade union, and you can imagine that caused quite a number of conflicts, to say the least. Golda Meir, who was the last but one Labour Zionist prime minister, described Histadrut as a big labor union that wasn't just a trade union organization, it was a great colonizing agency. Pinchas Lavon, who was Secretary General of it, and a former minister in Ben-Gurion's cabinet, described it as a general organization to its core. It is not a trade union. And Zev Sternhell, who I've just mentioned, the founding myths of Zionism, described Histadrut as a state in preparation. Histadrut was the major organization preparing the way for the Israeli state, in other words. In 1930, Hapoel Hatzair and Achdut HaAvodah, having cooperated in forming Histadrut, then merged and became Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party. And the Israeli Labour, Mapai, when it became a government in Israel, formed the government, led the government for 30 years from 1949 to 1977, when Likud replaced it. But to go back again, there were, say, three major campaigns that Histadrut and the Labour Zionist waged. One was Jewish land, one was Jewish labor, and the other was Jewish produce. In other words, Jews should not buy anything from Arabs either. There should be an entirely self-enclosed Jewish economy. And probably the best description of what he calls the dilemmas of a socialist Zionist was by David Hacohen, who was a former managing director of Solel Bonner, Histadrut's building company. And he explained the problems he faced, the dilemmas he faced as a socialist Zionist. And I'm quoting here, and you can get this quote, it's quite widespread. David Hurst's The Gun and the Olive Branch quotes it in full, and it's actually a very good book as well. He said, "I had to fight my friends on the issue of Jewish socialism, to defend the fact that I would not accept Arabs in my trade union, the Histadrut, to defend preaching to housewives that they should not buy at Arab stores, to defend the fact that we stood guard at orchards to prevent Arab workers from getting jobs there, to pour kerosene on Arab tomatoes, to attack Jewish housewives in the market and smash Arab eggs they had bought, to praise to the skies the Keren Kayemet Jewish Fund, Jewish National Fund, that sent Hanking to Beirut to buy land from absentee Effendi landlords, and to throw the Falahin Arab peasants off the land. To buy dozens of dunhams from an Arab is permitted, but to sell, God forbid, one Jewish dunham to an Arab is prohibited. To take Rothschild's, the incarnation of capitalism, as a socialist, and to name him the benefactor. To do all that was not easy, but nonetheless, he and others did it. That was, in essence, Jewish socialism or Zionist socialism. The reality was that Zionist socialism or labor Zionism, whatever it was, the collective settlements of the kibbutz were never even ever thought of as a socialist enterprise. Quite the contrary. They were a collective form of colonization. In the initial stages of colonization, the colonizers come together, if only for protection. You saw that in the American colonies where the wagons would circle. You saw that in South Africa with the Boer Trek, and you certainly saw that in Palestine, where the state had to be created from the very beginning. There was no state there. The first task of Labour Zionism was, in fact, to build the state, and the first task of the kibbutzim was to mark out the boundaries of that state. So the kibbutzim were primarily stockade and watchtower settlements. They weren't ever intended to be profitable. And the person who directed the creation of those, who was the biggest ally of the Labour Zionists, was someone who otherwise would be seen as a complete reactionary. That is Arthur Rupin, who was the director of the Palestine office from 1908 onwards. Rupin, as I mentioned last week, was a strong believer in social Darwinism. He vetted Jewish immigrants, and only 20% of them passed muster. He brought over the Yemenite Jews to do the main work. So everything, the kibbutzim was collective, certainly, but there were collective colonizers. And literally everything, I'm quoting here, everything was the property of the collective, including the individual's thoughts. And why was it? They had separate children's houses. They had collective, they had canteens for everybody. Property did not belong to any person. And the reason for much of this was that it deliberately attempted to break bonds of affection, if you like, the link between parents and children, for example. And the reason was because these were the cream of what became the Israeli army. They provided the Haganah and the Palmach militias in the pre-state period. They had a very high rate of loss and attrition. And so it made sense for them to become almost the germs of a Jewish Sparta in many ways. And so being a collective organization at that point in time fitted exactly with the priorities of the Zionist movement in terms of the land of Israel, or the Israeli state as it became. Zev Sternal, who I refer to again, his book, as I say, is a classic in many ways, so it's hard reading, described Labour Zionism as nationalist socialism. He would have used the term National Socialism, but, and I quote, it has been contaminated by association with the Nazis. And that was true of Labour Zionism. Ben Gurion, as I said, coined the slogan from class to nation. And what he meant by that was the class struggle was transformed from a struggle against employers, that is Jewish employers primarily, into a struggle against the Arabs. The Arabs were the class enemy for the Zionists. And this is not unique. If you think back to Nazi Germany, who were the capitalists in the eyes of the Nazis, the left, the Strasserites, the left Nazis? It was the Jews. The Jews were the symbol of capitalism, which of course let the Gentile, the non-Jewish capitalists off the hook. Well, the same was absolutely true with Zionism. Jewish capitalists who were happy to go along with the Zionist ideas and to only employ Jews were fine. There was no struggle against them whatsoever at all. It was the Arabs who became, if you like, the class enemy and against whom the struggle was waged. And of course, it was a struggle. It was, and we need to understand that how Labour Zionism turned out. We know today, I mean, in the Labour Party, who is it who has led the campaign against Jeremy Corbyn and the left in the Labour Party for the past 5 years? It's been the Labour Zionists, the Jewish Labour movement. I mean, that is the result of the generation of socialist Zionism. There isn't as much as a trace of socialism left in them. But this was a slow process. I mean, there were many people who went, pioneers who went to Palestine in the early 20th century, who would have been considered themselves socialists. And it was Zionism, in a sense, the realities of colonization, which led to them moving to the right. But there were still many. I mean, some of them left the Zionist movement and joined the Communist Party. There were others, although I don't have time for it, the Gedud Avodah, the work brigades, many of them were anti-Zionist. They were workers who worked from project to project, building the roads and so on. And there was almost an internal war in the Zionist movement in the 1920s between these workers and the Zionist movement. Literally, some of the northern kibbutzim where they were based were starved out. But Labour Zionism itself, once the Israeli state was formed, became parties of the state. Mapam, which was the left Zionist party, and Mapai, which was Ben-Gurion, the party of the mainstream Israeli Labour Party, led by David Ben-Gurion. And it's actually interesting that in 1949, the two parties, Mapai and Mapam, obtained 65 seats out of 120 in the Knesset, an absolute majority. Compare that to today, when the two Labour Zionist parties have 13, and that is a rise from 7 in the previous Knesset. So Labour Zionism has really no social or political role left in Israel today. But in 1949, Ben-Gurion, when faced with the possibility of a Labour Zionist majority in the Knesset, chose instead the representatives of what became the religious Zionist party, the National Religious Party, over Mapam. And Mapam, in fact, was not part of that governing coalition. So the Israeli Labour Party has always been a party, in essence, of the right, the centre right, if you like, in Israel. But it was Mapai and the Israeli Labour government which set the scene for the creation of apartheid in the Israeli state. They continued to expel Arabs from Israel throughout the 1950s. They kept the Palestinians in Israel under military rule until 1966. And until 1959, Histadrut, the Zionist trade union, did not even admit Arabs to membership. And it took them another 6-7 years until 1966 before they actually changed the name from the General Confederation of Hebrew Labour. I think I am going to leave it there. I don't think there is anything particularly, except maybe just to touch on the Jewish East End of London, since that is fairly relevant to people in Britain. I mean, there is the belief, there is the suggestion that the Jewish labour movement and what was Poale Zion was the Jewish section of the Labour Party. In fact, it never was considered to be such. The British Labour Party recognised and allowed the affiliation as a Socialist Society of Poale Zion in 1920, precisely because it was a colonising group, it was a colonising party. It had nothing to do with them being Jewish socialists. If they were seriously interested in the Jewish section, Jewish socialist section of the Labour Party, they would have allowed the Bund, for example, to affiliate. And throughout the 20s and 30s, the Zionists, and particularly Poale Zion, was incredibly weak in the British Labour movement and amongst Jewish workers. As a correspondent to the Young Zionist publication in 1932 wrote, "The tendency in the best part of our Jewish working class is to join the Communist Party, and that Zionism, quote, has made no headway among young working class Jews." And the reason for this was quite simple, that it was the Communist Party who led the fight against fascism, against Oswald Mosley. Poale Zion and the Zionist movement did really absolutely nothing. So there was no reason for Jewish workers to join Poale Zion. And indeed, the Zionist movement itself was very wary of organising in the East End, precisely because it was filled with communists, anarchists, and other radicals. So the idea that there was ever a golden age of Labour Zionism is simply a nonsense. And in fact, David Cesarani writes that in the 1930s, Zionism was in a state of collapse in the East End. I mean, East End was, if you like, the heartland of the Jewish community in Britain. It wasn't where the Jewish bourgeoisie lived, but thousands of Jewish workers lived there. And in 1945, I mean, after the Second World War, it was the Jewish voters of Mile End who were responsible for the election of Phil Piratin, a communist MP in Mile End. So I think we can understand the flavour of what was happening, and also the changing nature of the Jewish community, because you certainly wouldn't find 50% of Jewish voters in any constituency today voting for the Communist Party. We know that only a fragment of them support the Labour Party. So there's been a massive shift in the nature and the class composition of British Jews. And that, of course, explains why a majority support Zionism today. I think I've probably gone on long enough. In fact, I'm sure I have. So I'm going to finish and let people ask questions and make contributions. Thank you.
Right, thanks, Tony. I'm hoping that loads of people are going to sit their hands up now, because that was really interesting. I've got a couple of comments in the Q&A, but I'm hoping that those comrades will want to put those forward themselves. I think I would ask myself actually for Tony. What was the relationship between the Zionists and the Stalinists? I know that actually, of course, the Stalinists and the Russian bureaucracy and so on actually supported to a degree the foundation of the Israeli state and actually exported arms to it. And obviously then some fairly key relationships and the fact that obviously the Stalinists have been around preventing revolutionary movements, which was of course their main role for 60 years. So is anybody else wanting to ask a question or please put your hand up. I will read out these two questions which are in the chat. There's a question from Victor Logan, who asked, does Tony know that he's off centre, which is a normal Tony thing, and asks, is it right that the current Israeli Prime Minister, i.e. Netanyahu, is on record as indicating that the only issue of disagreement he had with the Nazis was their anti-Semitism? There's a second question, is there any possibility of educating the public as to the true nature of Zionism? Well, obviously, the ruling class is quite determined that should not happen, but events. Right, okay. I'm hoping people are going to start sticking their hands up now.
There's also a question from Pamela in the Q&A.
Okay, yes. And Pamela's also asked, on the history of the Communist Party, how did they betray the Arabs? And how did the promises of freedom, not quite sure I understand the second part, in terms of the promises of freedom to the, I'm presuming that's the Arab reaction to the betrayal by the Communist Party.
Do you want me to take those now, or?
Yeah, you might as well start with those.
Well, we've got one question here. Our usual chair and speaker, Kevin Bean, has joined us.
All right.
Ask the question. Hello, Kevin.
Okay. Hello,
Kevin.
It's a question, Tony, about the about Zionism and the Bund in Eastern Europe, and in particular the nature of the Bund. You mentioned its relationship with the RSDLP.
Can you speak up just a bit? Sorry.
Sorry. It's a question about the relationship between the Bund and the RSDLP, and in particular, I suppose it's sort of politics in terms of cultural autonomy. Are those politics influenced by the sort of Austro-Marxism? In other words, that it sees the Jewish population as a cultural nation rather than a political nation. And I suppose then really it's whether this shades off in any way or contributes in any way to the development of Zionism. I know I've read some of your other articles and so on where you say that most Polish Jewish people supported the Bund. And indeed, I remember quite a witty remark you made that it would mean that most Polish Jews were actually anti-Semitic because they weren't Zionists. But I wondered whether that in arguing that the Jewish population had a particular status, whether this laid any sort of ground for Zionism, or whether there was a very clear distinction. Because of course, you know, the point that we've been discussing over the last few weeks is the nature of the Jewish population in Europe as the minority, but whether they have a sort of national sense of themselves, and then whether that national sense is orientated towards Palestine or for somewhere else. So I'm interested in that. I don't know as much about the Bund as I should do. And so I'm wondering if you can see that a recognition of a sort of special cultural status for Jewish people then opens up the way for Zionism at a later date. For example, did many of the Bundists, you know, at a later stage, can we see any sort of connections between that and Zionism, or are all those connections really destroyed by the extermination of the Jewish population by the Nazis?
Okay, I mean, I think I'll deal with the last point first because it is quite interesting.
Tony, you're now...
yes. See if that's any better.
Yeah,
I might have to crowdfund for a new camera for you.
Yeah, well, it's the blue tack that sticks it on, I'm afraid.
Back then.
I would say there was always a very sharp distinction between Zionism and the Bund. Remember, Herzl was going around Europe promising the leaders of the various countries, the Kaiser and so on, that Zionism was the alternative to socialism. And he went to visit von Plehve to negotiate the legalization of the Zionist movement in 1903, August 1903. Yeah, it was August 1903, barely 4 months after the Kishinev pogrom. The Kishinev pogrom resounded through Europe. It was publicized by the Times and the New York Times, the kind of savagery of that pogrom. And it did horrify people. And for Herzl to go and negotiate with von Plehve just 4 months after, it produced a mass revulsion at what he had done. There is no doubt about that. He was even advised by his own compatriots not to travel on from St. Petersburg, where he met the Tsarist ministers, to Vilna, which was the capital of Polish Lithuania, because of the fierce reaction against him. So I think it's fairly clear that the Bund was not Zionist. Look, the point is that Zionism, the cardinal rule for Zionism, their cardinal precept, was that the Jewish people everywhere, whether they were living in Argentina or in Britain or in France or in India, they formed one people, one nation. And that is quite clearly absurd. People with no shared economy, no shared territory, no shared language, nothing except their religion in common, to form one single people. It's really that is a concept of race, not religion, not politics. That was a Zionist view of the Jewish people. It pertains to this day. The Bund made no such claims. All they claimed was, in essence, that the Jews were a national minority in Eastern Europe, in the Pale settlement in Poland and Russia. Now, you could argue whether they were or not, but regardless, that was not a Zionist agenda. I know in 1903, I think it was, when the Bunds left the RSDLP, Plekhanov accused the Bundists of being Zionists with seasickness. But I don't think that was altogether fair. It is quite clear that the major priority of the Bunds, which wasn't a revolutionary organization, certainly not in Poland, was the fight against anti-Semitism and the conditions that Polish workers faced. That was simply not the priority of Zionism. So I think there was a very clear break between Bundism, which was anti-Zionist throughout. There was never a Zionist current within it, and the Zionists themselves. And if you read the autobiography or biographies of Ben-Gurion and other Labour Zionist leaders, one thing that should strike you is that from the very beginning of this Labour Zionism, they saw as their main enemy the Bund, and also, of course, the Soviets. And in the Soviet Union, I mean, Poale Zion collapsed into the Bolsheviks. I mean, Palestine was no longer relevant. It had no relevance. It was the Bolsheviks had outlawed anti-Semitism, and they had fought anti-Semitism, and they'd said, if you support anti-Semitism, you support the Tsar. So what was the purpose of Zionism? Most of its cadre fell away. Those who didn't emigrated to Palestine. So in my view, there was a very, very clear separation. It's true that in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Zionists and the Bund fought together. But I would say that wasn't because they were Zionists. It was despite their Zionism that they fought anti-Semitism. And in fact, and the Nazis. And in fact, the Palestinian parties in Palestine, the Zionist parties in Palestine, they urged their cadre in Poland not to take part in resistance, but to save themselves for the fight in Palestine against the Arabs, which to them was the priority. Building a Jewish state was the priority, not fighting the Nazis or anti-Semitism. So I think that was clear. Regarding some of the other questions, Benjamin Netanyahu, did he say that the only difference with the Nazis was anti-Semitism? I'm not aware that Netanyahu has done so, but I'm certainly aware that many other Zionists have said so. There were two rabbis, I think it was Raziel was one of their names, you can look them up, who came out, they ran a pre-military training yeshiva in Israel. And they said quite clearly that, yes, Hitler was right, but unfortunately he got the wrong people. It should have been the Arabs, but of course there were no Arabs in Germany, so that was really a piece of nonsense. What Netanyahu did was in many ways just as bad. The 2017 World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem, he invented a history. Many of you will know of the Mufti of Jerusalem. He was appointed by the British in 1920, Hajj al-Hamin Husseini. He was appointed Mufti, which was the religious leader of the Muslims. There was an election and he came fourth. But despite that, the Zionists, through their High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, who was an ardent Zionist, put him in the position of Mufti because he was the most reactionary candidate by far. The Zionists always preferred reactionaries, and the Mufti ended up supporting the Nazis, not because he was a racist so much as because he saw the Nazis as being the opponents of the Zionists, which was absurd because, of course, Hitler probably bears more responsibility for the founding of Israel than anyone else. I mean, the critical mass of the Jewish population in Palestine occurred because of the rise of Nazism. And what Netanyahu said after a famous meeting in November 1941 between the Mufti and Hitler was that Hitler had only supported the expulsion of the Jews, but it was the Mufti who persuaded them that if the Jews were expelled, they would go to Palestine, and therefore he should exterminate them. That is what he said in his his speech to the Zionist Congress. I've written an article on this for Jacobin magazine, so if you Google it, you will find the details of it. Of course, Netanyahu was immediately attacked, not least by the Zionist Holocaust historians, because it was patently absurd. The Holocaust didn't begin in November 1941. It began in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Killing squads called the Einsatz Gruppen were sent in the wake of the German army to exterminate the Jews by shooting them. And over 1 million Jews were shot in ditches and then buried in the forest. And there were 4 such squads, A to D, which covered the whole of White Russia, from the Baltic republics right down to Odessa. So that was what Netanyahu said, and it's a fairly familiar tale amongst Zionist zealots that the people who were responsible for the Holocaust were in fact the Palestinians. It's a load of rubbish, of course, but the reason is because the Israeli state has been embarked on a policy ever since 1948 of trying to paint the Palestinians as the new Nazis. The Palestinians don't oppose Zionism because it displaced them from the land, because it made them into second or third class citizens. The only reason that Palestinians oppose Zionism in the state of Israel is because they hate Jews. We're all aware of that, and that's what the Zionists say today. That's what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition is about. If you oppose Israel, the real reason for your opposition is because of your hatred of Jews, your anti-Semitism. So they redefined anti-Semitism, of course. We all know what the reality is, that most anti-Semites and fascists in the world support the Israeli state. People like Tommy Robinson, Richard Spencer, Donald Trump, an ardent Zionist, but he also accused American Jews of disloyalty for not supporting their country, their real homeland, which Trump emphasized was the Israeli state, not the United States. So that's my answer to that question. As for Stalinism and Zionism, Mapam, which was the small left-wing Zionist party, which had its own kibbutz federation, Kibbutz Ha'artzi, was pro-Soviet up to about 1953 with the Slansky trials in Czechoslovakia, where Jews, communist Jews, were accused of being Zionists, and you had that come up again in Poland in the 1970s, I think. I mean, Stalinism certainly dabbled with anti-Semitism, there can be no doubt. And in fact, Stalin, just before he died, had been involved in the doctor's plots, but it never came to fruition because of his death. Stalinism certainly undermined the communist parties of the Middle East. There were large communist parties dotted throughout the Middle East, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq in particular. And what the Soviets did, with their spokesman being Gomulka, their UN representative and foreign secretary, is in 1947, they supported UN Resolution 191, which partitioned Palestine and established Israel as a Jewish state. The reason they did that, and it was utter stupidity on their part, was to get British imperialism out of the Middle East. But of course, British imperialism was a waning power anyway, although it had alliances with the Iraqi dictator Nouri Said and was still based in Egypt, although nominally it was an independent government. Britain maintained a presence, but clearly the up-and-coming imperialist power in the Middle East was the United States. And so the actions of the Soviet Union simply reinforced the presence of the United States, even if it was at the expense of the British. And we know that in 1956, with the Suez War, there was a direct clash between British and American imperialism. And Roosevelt slapped down the British and the French for their secret conspiracy with Israel to invade Egypt after the nationalization of the Suez Canal. But that simply testifies to the stupidity of Stalinism. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between the Soviets and Hitler was another example of their total stupidity, because they actually believed they could ally with Hitler. It wasn't simply a tactical measure. They actually deported hundreds of communist refugees in Russia back into Hitler's jaws to show how they were acting in good faith. So that is the history of Stalinism, I'm afraid. Anyone else?
Yeah, we've had another few comrades to speak. We have Graham Perry. Ask a question. Can you unmute yourself, comrade?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, no problem.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good. Thank you. We've covered a lot of ground this evening, very interesting, but I'm trying to draw a few points together because when you cover such a large period of history and a lot of points within it, you can lose a bit of focus. From the perspective, if I could just say a few words, is that permissible, or do you just...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So first thing I think I bear in mind is that one of the prime initiators of Zionism was British imperialism. And I don't think there's going to be any disagreement about that. The Balfour Declaration may have happened because there was pressure applied by Jewish leaders in London, Weitzman and others, to Balfour and the government in 1917. But it accorded with British imperial interests. I heard Tony say that Britain was on the decline, etc. But we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century. Britain had big geopolitical ambitions. It was still involved with the Suez Canal. It was still involved east of Suez. And it was still a large imperial power. The situation in the Middle East was very important to British imperialism, and it coincided with the pressure coming from Weitzman and other Jewish leaders for a state in the Middle East. Now, what was the movement behind that? And here I might disagree with Tony, but the pressure for me, and he's mentioned the pogrom, the Lishnov pogrom, but the momentum behind the strength of Zionism, as Weitzman made clear, was the persecution of Jews in Russia and Poland. That was the inspiration. That is what gave Zionism a tremendous fillip, because people were looking, Jews were looking in the Far East, in Eastern Europe, for some kind of salvation, some kind of deliverance from the constant aggression of pogroms and anti-Semitism. There were some other points as well. There was the Dreyfus trial that was very important in the mentality of Herzl. And there was also the unification of Italy in 1861, made a big impact upon Jabotinsky. But the momentum behind the creation of the State of Israel had less to do with socialism and more to do with Jews looking for a salvation as an escape. And that was what was uppermost in their mind, and their justification for it was the argument that they had been there all those years ago before they had been sent out into the diaspora. And that led, and I just want to make this point, Weitzman's famous speech to the British House of Commons about the need for a Jewish state to protect the Jews from constant persecution. The weakness in the Jewish position has always been its lack of attention to the position of the Palestinians. And that's another issue which has bedeviled the State of Israel ever since its birth and continues to split people, Jews in the UK, many of whom are very pro-Israel, but many of whom are pro-Israel with a big conscience, because they know that what happened to the Palestinians was not right. But what was uppermost in the minds of many Jews at this period was an escape from persecution. And remember, Weitzman's speech to the British House of Commons, to the Sir Robert Peel Commission in 1936, was before the 6 million died in the concentration camp. So the combination of the two created a momentum amongst Jewish people which said, we've got to be masters of our own destiny, we've got to be in control. We're not in control in Russia, we're not in control in Poland, we're not in control in Germany. The only place we can be in control is back in Palestine. And that was a salvation for Jews. It was the writing on the wall for the Palestinians. And that dispute has remained absolutely at the core. It's not so much the concept of Zionism as such, except in the sense that Jews believe their salvation can only come by having a major presence in Palestinians. I think it was the split in the Jewish leadership between the moderates and the radicals, Jabotinsky and others, who sought to create from the beginning a Jewish state at the expense of the Palestinians. And it's been a problem for Jews all along, especially for Jews on the left, who find sympathy with the plight of Jews looking for a home for themselves to be saved from salvation, but also aware that the success in creating the State of Israel has created the refugees in Gaza and created hardship for people who were previously the main occupants of that very land. I just want to make that point. I don't know whether it's been made before. I'm sure it has. But I just find, listening to Tony, that these are the two important points that I think need to be brought about. The momentum for the creation of the State of Israel came from the persecution of Jews. And in being persecuted, the Jews didn't pay sufficient attention to the plight of the Palestinians, which was made worse by the arrival of large numbers of Jews into Palestine in the period 1917 to 1940. Thank you for allowing me.
Thank you, Conrad.
If you want, I'll take that one up now, because it is quite a major contribution. And I also disagree with it. In fact, the vast majority of Jews never sought or thought that their salvation would lie in a separate state. I mean, I've already said that of the 2.5 million Jews who emigrated from Russia, the Pale Settlement, between the middle of the 19th century and 1914, barely 1%, about 30,000, went to Palestine, and many of them came back because they couldn't actually stand it. Certainly the persecution of Jews was a pretext, I would agree. But I would say, sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person who asked the question.
Graham?
Graham Perry. Graham Perry.
Graham Perry.
I'm a Labour Party member.
Sure. That was the pretext. I have no doubt about it. But I say to you that you shouldn't mistake rhetoric for reality. The Zionists said all sorts of things, Weizmann included, but they didn't mean it. They talked about friendship with the Arabs, and yet all of their actions were designed to exclude them. And that wasn't simply a few on the right, Jabotinsky. Ben-Gurion was as equally a transferist, a person who believed in the expulsion of the Arabs, as Jabotinsky did. And there was no difference in principle between Jabotinsky, who was the leader of, in essence, the fascist Zionists, the revisionists they called themselves, and David Ben-Gurion. At best, they differed on tactics. Ben-Gurion understood that you had to work with the British until you were strong enough to get rid of them. Jabotinsky wanted the fight against the British to start at a much earlier stage, in the early 30s, when the Zionists were not strong enough to actually evict the British. And in fact, Ben-Gurion was absolutely right. As a result of the Arab general strike from 1936 to 39, the British armed Zionists, the Jewish settlement police, were created, which transformed itself into Palmach, which is the equivalent of our SAS, the shock troops of the Zionist militias. So it is a great mistake to believe that the purpose of Zionism was to create a safe refuge for Jews. The purpose of, I mean, Ben-Gurion explains this, and I'm just going to go into some notes I have, and I'll try and quote from them. Give me 1 second. It's
I don't want to interrupt you at all, Tony, and maybe we can't continue everything. It's just that it's Friday night and I've got to go and light the candles.
That's okay. In one particular memo from Ben-Gurion, which was to the Jewish Agency Executive of the 17th of December 1938, that is very shortly after Kristallnacht, when there was massive pressure to admit Jewish refugees to the West. And in fact, 10,000 were admitted to Britain in the Kinder transport, which incidentally the Zionists opposed. And Ben-Gurion wrote in this memo, quite worriedly, and he said, if the Jews are faced with a choice between the refugee problem and rescuing Jews from the concentration camps on the one hand, and aid for the National Museum in Palestine on the other, the Jewish sense of pity will prevail, and our people's entire strength will be directed to aid for the refugees in the various countries. Zionism will vanish from the agenda, and indeed not only world public opinion in England and America, but also from Jewish public opinion. We are risking Zionism's very existence if we allow the refugee problem to be separated from the Palestine problem. And what that meant in practice was that Zionism was vehemently opposed to opening up refugees in any country bar Palestine itself. It used the refugees as a battering ram against the British immigration policy. Zionism was never a movement to save refugees. On the contrary, it sabotaged a whole number. This is more my talk next week, but it actually sabotaged attempts at rescue. For instance, in Alaska, which didn't have any immigration barriers, unlike the rest of the United States, the Zionists were vehemently opposed to allowing Jews to go there. Stephen Weiss, their leader in America, said it was too cold for the Jews. Well, I imagine they would have preferred to be too cold than too warm in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. But that was the Zionist reality. I mean, there's a whole lot more I could say. Zionism became a movement to create a Jewish racial state, to perpetuate the Jewish people in the form of statehood. It was never about rescuing Jews. And I can't emphasize that enough. Zionism, it was called cruel Zionism in a sense. That, I mean, Weizmann was also clear in his address to the 1936 Zionist Congress, that most Jews should be written off in Europe. They will die or they will not, they will become human dust, he said. It was only a small portion who could be rescued. And indeed, the immigration certificates the British issued were dealt out very sparingly to only the fittest, the youngest, etc. of Jews in Europe, apart from those who had capital to take with them. Zionism was never a refugee movement, and indeed it set its face against refugeeism. That's what it termed those who simply wanted to rescue refugees wherever they were. And indeed in Britain, the president, Selig Brodetsky, the president of the Board of Deputies, who was a Zionist, deliberately sabotaged the Chief Rabbi's Rescue Committee, which wanted to bring thousands of Jews to this country. They brought some Jews, but they faced opposition both from the Zionists and also from Herbert Morrison, who was the Labour Home Secretary in the wartime coalition. So I do want to disagree quite strongly with the last speaker. Zionism presents itself as a movement to save Jews, but it actually never was that, which is one reason why they never fought anti-Semitism where it occurred. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Cool. Right, thanks, Tony. We have Pamela to ask you a question, thanks.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can't hear you.
Oh, you're muted, comrade. You've managed to mute yourself.
All right now.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Graham, one of the answers, also I agree with Tony, was that the Jews in Europe wanted to come to America and Britain, and both these countries put in anti-immigration laws. Was it 1905, I think, Balfour, who was then Foreign Secretary, to stop this wave of Jews coming. And I think it was 1924 in America, these anti-immigration laws were put in. And that's where Jews wanted to go. They didn't want to go to an empty desert land, thank you very much. They wanted to go to where Jews already had established communities. So I think, you know, that's very important to understand. I'll come in later. Thanks.
Just to say, give a slightly different view on that, Pamela. The Evian conference locked the door on Jews coming to America, coming to Britain. They closed the doors. Apart from kinder transport, there was only one country in the world that accepted the Jews at that time, and that was China.
No. It was San Domingo in Evian, offered 100,000 places, and the Zionists fought it. They hated it. They got a report from the Brookings Institution to say it wasn't feasible. But I can tell you...
It was also the case that the Jews were offered, was it Tanganyika? They were offered Peru. There was suggestions that Jews en masse should move. But if you go back, and I would urge all of you listening tonight to go and read that famous speech, that famous submission by Weizmann, and he was the leader of the Jewish group at that time, explaining why Zionism was the solution to the persecution. I know Tony takes a different view. I accept that. We'll just have to agree to disagree. But before you make your final decision on that, please read Weizmann's speech and look at the wording that he uses. It's one of the most powerful testimonies. Now, there were always within the Zionist movement different groups, different manipulations, different priorities. And there were some people that used the Holocaust to create the state of Israel, help create the state of Israel when some Jews wanted to stay in France, some Jews wanted to stay in Britain. And David Ben-Gurion did upset Jewish leaders in Europe by saying, come to Israel, come to Israel. So there's always been a dispute. I don't pretend otherwise. But the momentum and the initiative wasn't racial, because the Jews are not one race. The Jews are white, the Jews are Middle Eastern, the Jews are black. There's no one race of Jews. The Jews aren't a religion either, because more Jews don't go to religion than do go to religion, do go to shul. And the Jews aren't a nation for the reasons that are obvious. More people are outside Israel than are inside Israel. That's part of the problem with trying to understand Jews. They're a very, very mixed bag. But let's not let me not take up too much time, because I don't want to make myself unpopular with all the other people who've got things to say. So Matthew, I'll put a lip on it now.
Okay, thank you, Conrad. Yeah. Tony, there's a couple more questions being asked in the chat. First from Sue Owen. My dad lived in the East End in the 1930s. He and most of his family joined the Communist Party after 1936, presumably after the Battle of Cable Street, which I think, if I remember rightly, the Communist Party actually didn't call for its members to participate in the Battle of Cable Street. It was the fact that they did anyway, because obviously they defend themselves. When did the Jewish community in the East End start to support Zionism? The second question from Jack Thomas. Does Tony know why Nathan Birnbaum, who coined the term Zionism, eventually ditched Zionism?
Right. Can I firstly, I'll just very briefly refer to what Graham Perry said. Weizmann made many good speeches which were emotional about rescuing Jews. But what he actually said internally to the Zionist organization was different. For instance, in a speech in 1935 to the Zionist executive, he said, and I'm quoting, the Zionist movement would have to choose between the immediate rescue of Jews and the establishment of a national project which would ensure lasting redemption for the Jewish people. Under such circumstances, the movement, according to Weizmann, must choose the latter course. That was the reality of his position. What he actually said in public for the press was, of course, entirely different. For instance, when the British decided to make Britain a refuge for Jews rather than Palestine, this was, the kinder transport, Malcolm offered to take the children here, but without any guarantee that they could go on to Palestine. And Weizmann refused. He said to Malcolm, we shall fight you. And when I say fight, I mean fight. The Zionists were extremely unhappy about the kinder transport. And they were even more unhappy, incidentally, about the Evian conference. They refused to have anything to do with it. And they were extremely pleased when it failed, as it did fail. And Graham says, well, the Jews aren't a race. Well, I agree they're not a race, but that doesn't mean that people can't be racists. I mean, the Nazis were racist towards the Jews, but the Jews weren't a race. But the Zionists, in essence, the project of the Zionists was to create a state based on race by transforming the Jews from a religion to a race. That was the whole nature of it. You'll have to remind me of the second question, Matthew. Sorry.
If I unmute myself, I might be able to talk to you. Okay, is this the one about Nathan Birnbaum?
Oh yes, Nathan Birnbaum. Yeah, he coined the slogan Zionism, the term Zionism, and he gradually moved away from Zionism. I don't have any great insight into why he did that, but clearly he, like actually quite a number of Zionist zealots, began to see that it was a dead end. It didn't offer the salvation that it promised. And certainly by, I think, 1919, he was a committed anti-Zionist. I think he also became very religious as well. But he wasn't the only one. Zangwill also moved away from Zionism, became a territorialist. The editor of Judicial Rundschau in Germany, the main Zionist paper, likewise abandoned Zionism. I mean, the history of Zionism is littered with people who see the light in the end. Is there any?
The other one, of course, is Sue's question about when did the Jewish community in the East End start to support Zionism?
I think, I mean, it's always difficult to know. I mean, Poale Zion never had more than about 500 members, and most of them were not in the East End. They were Fabian types who lived in the West End or in North London, etc. So the actual Zionist base in the East End was very small. It was seen as being completely irrelevant. Don't forget, most Zionists joined the Jewish Chronicle and the Board of Deputies in imposing any serious mobilization against the fascists, and it was fascist violence above all that concerned the Jewish community in the East End. So Zionism in many ways was simply an irrelevance. I mean, the Jewish East End was a hothouse of different revolutionary, communist, socialist, anarchist currents. And you can read William Fishman's excellent book on East End Jewish radicals. He was really the Jewish historian of the East End to get a flavor of it. But I would say that Zionism really took off in the Jewish community post 1945, in particular with the establishment of the Jewish state. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that given the Holocaust and the murder, extermination of 6 million Jews or so, Israel was seen as a recompense, if you like, compensation. I mean, Zionism itself, the Zionist leaders understood very well. I mean, during the war, they were clear that their main goal was establishing a Jewish state, not rescuing Jewish refugees. But to the majority of Jewish people, it was a defeat at the hands of Hitler, because of course it was a defeat, the ascendancy of fascism, which gave it a boost. But even in 1945, when Hitler had been defeated, as I say, there was a large sympathy and support amongst the Jewish population of the East End for the Communist Party, so that half of the constituency in Mile End, half of the votes for Philip Haratin are estimated to have come from Jewish voters. So it's clear that Zionism had not established a base by then. Certainly it was growing in strength, without a doubt, but I would say it was really from the late 40s, 1950s onwards. And in the Jewish community in Britain, it was also the rapid rise socio-economically in the Jewish population. I mean, in the beginning, I mean, you had impoverished Jewish immigrants who were employed by almost equally impoverished Jewish masters in small tailors' workshops. I mean, that was a class struggle to a large extent. There were two big tailor strikes in 1889 and 1912, both of which were victorious. But it was the growing, involvement in trade unions and so on, which led the way in the East End. And Zionism had nothing at all to say about that. I mean, this Simon Blumenfeld in a novel, Jew Boy, said about Zionism, why should we exchange one set of exploiters for another simply because they're Jewish? I mean, that was the reality of how most people would think. Of course, there were times when, I mean, Herzl, when he came to speak, I think it was 1899 in the East End, spoke to thousands of people. He was seen as the kind of new messiah, but it had no lasting implications. On the contrary, the Zionist-supported candidates in the 1900 election were all defeated. Being endorsed by the Zionist Federation was a liability. It wasn't a bonus. So these things changed with time, just as the identity, the socio-economic status of Jews in Britain has changed. I mean, that's why, I mean, today, most Jews don't live in the East End. In fact, there's hardly any Jews. I mean, I used to go, one of my favorite restaurants was Balloons in London, in the East End, just by Oldgate East Tube Station. When my father took me in the 1960s there, you would see queues right round the corner, you know, to get in. You'd have to wait half an hour. And yet it closed 20, 30 years ago because it lacked any custom, because Jews no longer lived there. They lived in Golders Green, Edgware, and so on. So there's been, that is part of the reason why Jews can be mobilized against Jeremy Corbyn in the way they weren't, and why people could be fooled into believing that Corbyn was an anti-Semite, because there has been a substantial change in the British Jewish community, which is today relatively affluent, privileged, white, doesn't suffer racism, and so on. That's not all Jews by any means. I mean, there's been a drop in support for Zionism, because Zionism by itself, I don't think, provides a sufficient identity for being Jewish.
Okay,
anyone else?
Yeah, well, Pamela wants to come back and say something else, and I've got another question for you, which could take a while.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So earlier, oh, sorry, I missed out. Earlier, I was talking about the Arab reaction, and Tony was saying about how.
Is Pam gone or something?
Oh, seems to have dropped off. Oh, she's back again now. She's reconnecting. Sorry.
Oh, right. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, how there were big communist parties in Syria, Egypt, Iraq. I think Iraq was one of the biggest.
Yes, it was.
Communist parties around. So I suppose my question is, what was happening there? I suppose what's his name? Saddam Hussein murdered a lot of the communists, and I don't know if a similar thing happened in Syria, etc. But I was just sort of wondering, you know, that whole period, 20s, 30s, 40s, what was happening to the Arab communist and socialist movement, really, in relation to Palestine. Yeah, I think that's it.
I'm not an expert in.
I'll just ask you one more question, which might be a bit distraction, which is, I've been asked in the chat by Peter Morton if you can give a brief history of Polit Zion in the Labour Party up to the advent of JLM, which is probably a book, but you know, I'm presuming you can say a few things.
Okay. To deal with Pam's question first, I say I'm not an expert in the communist parties of the Middle East, but there's no doubt that in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, there were large communist parties. I mean, it's one of the Zionist myths, of course, that during the war, the Arabs supported Hitler. It's simply not true. The support for the Nazis was very small, but there were large left-wing groups, not least the Communist Party. Stalin's decision in 1947 to support the fledgling Zionist state and the Zionist movement and the establishment of the State of Israel cut the ground from beneath them. They were Stalinist parties, so they were expected to follow the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. And as you can imagine, that policy was not particularly popular with the Arab masses. So they lost their social base. It's a simple answer. They flew against the demands of Arab nationalism. They opposed Zionism because the Communist parties then were not doing so. and we know what happened. So, I mean, many thousands left the communist parties, and Stalin's action, just as in Germany and elsewhere, weakened the communist parties significantly. I mean, that was the effect. As to the JLM, well, Pole Zion has existed since 1920. It's always been a backwater. It's been extremely inactive. I can remember when I became active in the Labour Party around Zionism in 1982, we rarely, if ever, encountered them. They were not an active group. In 2000, I think, and 4, Pole Zion changed its name to the Jewish Labour Movement. But there is no Jewish Labour Movement today. There was a time, I mean, in the beginning of the 20th century, when there was something like 32 Jewish trade unions. I mean, Jews were very, very active in the trade union movement. And when British workers, I mean, the TUC itself passed in the 1880s 3 resolutions calling for anti-alienist legislation. That is legislation to keep Jews out. Clearly, Jews felt that they weren't really a part of that trade union movement, so they formed their own separate unions, which were very militant. Of course, the British working class began to come round. I think 1903, Manchester Trades Council was the first Labour movement body to come out against the proposal to introduce anti-alienist legislation. But that was how it is. I mean, the Pole Zion has never had any serious input into politics, whether it's in the Zionist movement itself or in the Labour Party. And from 2004 onwards, it was dormant. But it was refounded in 2015. And there's an excellent article by Asa Winstanley in Electronic Intifada, which I suggest you Google. It was refounded for the specific purpose of getting rid of Corbyn. Why? Because it had certain privileges being a socialist society. It could submit resolutions to party conference. It could send a delegate to party conference. It had the right to affiliate to local Labour parties. This was very important. The JLM took on the mantle of challenging Corbyn. And so it's crazy when I read in the leaked Labour report that Corbyn and Milne were holding regular meetings with them, and they were trying to appease them by saying, and I'm quoting from the Labour leaked report, that Corbyn and his office were urging the Disputes Committee, or the Governance Legal Unit as it was called, to speed up the expulsions of Tony Greenstein, Jackie Walker, Mark Wadsworth, Ken Livingstone, in order to rebuild trust with Jewish stakeholders. You know, this was crazy. They didn't expel us, and of course, we all know that they simply upped their demands for more and more people to be expelled, until the JLM moved a motion of no confidence in Corbyn, and the Zionists have now got rid of him. So that is the history. But I don't think there's any serious history of Pole Zion. It was always a weak movement. There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind that come 2015 and Corbyn, money was pumped into it by the Israeli embassy. I don't think there's any doubt about that. They employed director Ella Rose, who was a free transfer from the Israeli embassy. So the links are there for all to see. But as an indigenous group within the Labour Party, Pole Zion has always been very, very weak.
Okay, I'm presuming there's nobody else, unless Pamela wants to come back again.
Right, I can't think at the moment. Oh yeah, there was one thing. Tony, are you going to put a reading list? Oh, you did talk about writing something, didn't you? Can you put a reading list up on the email of LLA Education?
Yes, what I will do, I'm hoping to kind of compile everything into a PDF file, which will include reading lists, but also many of my notes have footnotes attached to them, so you can actually gain from that. You can see what books I'm referring to. I mean, for this talk, I've recommended Founding Myths of Zionism by Zev Sternhall, which is the most copious description of the corruption of the Labour Zionist movement in Palestine.
What was the
I can go
title
into
again?
some depth. It is very, very detailed. It explains how there was never any democracy in Histadrut. We would hold an annual conference every 7 years, that people would not get elected, that there was significant corruption by Ben Gurion and his elite. It was never democratic. And he also goes into some of the conflict between the local branches and the central Histadrut, which was always reining them in and didn't want to see class conflict brought out. So there's that book. I've recommended Nathan Weinstock's Zionism, A False Messiah. If you want to read a Zionist history, and it's always useful to do so, you can't better Walter Lecoeur's A History of Zionism, which is really a series of major essays. So yes, I'm happy to recommend. It'll be quite a long reading list for people and so on, but it's also no substitute for going back to the sources I've quoted at length from Theodor Herzl's diaries, which are about 1,600 pages in length. I have read them all, and they are very interesting, and they give an insight into the mentality that Herzl and others following him would have. And I think, I mean, Graham mentioned about the desire of Zionism to form a Jewish refuge. I think if you read Herzl, you'll understand that it was far more than that. Okay. Oh, is there anyone else who's burning to ask a question or didn't understand?
I think we're done. Do you want to make a few concluding remarks and give us a brief preview of next week?
Okay, yes, I'll do so. My argument in essence is there was never a socialist Zionist movement. There were certainly socialists who were Zionists, because it's quite possible for individuals to hold contradictory ideas in their head. But the Labour Zionist movement was a movement of colonization from the very beginning. In many ways, it was worse than the revisionists, because the revisionists, for instance, did not support Jewish labor. They represented the kind of petty bourgeois capitalists in Palestine. They were quite happy to employ the cheapest labor, which happened to be Arab labor. Ben Gurion and the Labour Zionists insisted that employers should only employ Jewish labor. And the reason why is they wanted to exclude the Palestinians first from the economy and then from the state altogether. And we've seen with Israel, of course, the first 30 years laid down the basis of Zionist apartheid. And it was the Israeli Labour Party which did that. And today, I mean, the Labour Zionism has supported every war that's been launched by Likud, having launched quite a number of wars on its own account. So we see today, even the left Zionists comprise just 10% of the Knesset. The main battle is between the far right Zionists and the even further right Zionists, including now the election of an open Jewish Nazi, Itamar Gavir, who believes that you should receive 5 years in prison if a Jew sleeps with a non-Jew in Palestine, which is straight out of the Nuremberg laws. Next week is going to be probably the most controversial of the topics, which is Zionism during the Holocaust, which is also the title of a book I'm currently writing. And it details the relationship between the Nazi movement and the anti-Semites and the Zionists. You'll know that Ken Livingstone, for having touched on it, literally just touched on it, was subject to a massive counter-reaction. And unfortunately, the Corbynites collapsed, even though he was dealing with a totally factual issue, which is Havara. So I shall hopefully be producing a blog to introduce it, and I hope you can all read it before you come to this, because it will give you a background, and I'll try and give some of the major quotes. Really, what I intend to do is link the themes which are, I think, self-evident in the Zionist relationship with the Nazis. But my final point will be just to say that that the Zionist attitude to the Nazis was no different from their historical and traditional attitude to anti-Semitism. They did not treat the Nazis as a special case. They certainly had no premonition of what would take place. So my blog is, well, there's two, AZV SAS, blogspot.com. Shall I write it in the chat? Would that be easier for people?
Yes. Well, usually if you just Google a Tony Greenstein, it comes up.
Yes, I'll put it in the chat so you can see it. Okay, it's there if you want to copy it, anyone. I will be doing a blog. I can't say when because, as you all know, I was one of the 6 arrested on a Palestine Action mission to take out Elbit factory in Shenstone near Birmingham. And I'm up in court on Wednesday, so I shall only have Thursday to write it, so it probably won't be as full as it should have been. But anyway, thank you so much. It's been an excellent audience, good questions, and I look forward to the 4th in this series next week.
Okay. Well, thank you, comrades, for attending, and good luck to Tony for his court case.
I hope to get off curfew because I can't get out after 9 o'clock at night at the moment, but it's still better than being on remand. Yes,
Winston Gree's never a nice place. So anyway, yeah, good luck for that, and we all stand in solidarity with you, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you again.
Thanks very much, comrade.